Good afternoon. My name is Mark Gracie, and thank you for joining this Digital Compliance Hub webinar about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and getting to know what that might mean for you and your business, perhaps. So, as I said, my name is Mark Gracie. I have my main business is called Flavorify Digital, which is a digital consultancy, providing consultancy services to businesses operating online. Elements of that include work around digital compliance, so data protection, as well as online security and marketing compliance, so things like that about the Privacy Electronic Communication regulations, for example. And the Digital Compliance Hub is one of the services that I provide under that consultancy. Very, very different in terms of its approach, but I'll just talk about that a little bit towards the end. So this webinar is I'm probably going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes about the General Data Protection Regulation, and highlighting 10 particular areas of things to think about, because they're the main changes with the rules that are coming. You should see in your control panel towards somewhere towards the bottom the option for posting questions. So if something crops up during the talk, feel free to pop a question in there, and I'll try and pick those up at the end. So we'll have a Q&A at the end, and hopefully I've remembered to press the record button, so there should be a recording of this for you to go back through at your leisure. So what we're going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. Hopefully by the end of this webinar you'll have a good idea about what that means, and what, if anything, you need to worry about for your particular organisation or maybe your role. And what you might need to think about in terms of complying if it's something you do need to worry about. Just to put things into perspective, here's a timeline that sort of sets out where things have gone with data protection. We started with the Data Protection Directive in 1995, which was implemented as the current Data Protection Act in the UK in 1998. That's the regime that we've been working under for nearly 20 years, and obviously the Information Commissioner, through the Information Commissioner Office, or the ICO, produced guidance and best practice around that, which sort of goes a bit beyond what the Data Protection Act says or the Data Protection Directive says in legislative terms, but has very much become the approach for data protection compliance across the UK. Then in 2012, the first draft of the General Data Protection Regulation was published, and that led to the GDPR being formally adopted and published in 2016, with a 2 years gap before it is actually enforced. So that means that on the 25th of May 2018, so less than a year away, the General Data Protection Regulation will be in effect, and as I mentioned in a moment, that happens across the whole of Europe. In the meantime, we're working with a piece of legislation that will apply to the UK, and will replace the Data Protection Act, with a little bit of guidance so far from the Information Commissioner, particularly around consent. It's probably the most significant thing that they've published, but that's still only in draft. And the Article 29 Working Party, which is the European-wide party that is formed of similar organisations as our ICO across the whole of Europe, they get together and come up with approaches and guidance to how to interpret the legislation. And they've published a bit of guidance, but over the next year, we're going to see more and more guidance, more and more direction, and no doubt more and more interpretation of what the GDPR actually means in a practical sense. So things aren't as black and white as they probably ought to be or could be, in terms of saying, well, you all need to be compliant by the 25th of May next year. But actually, a lot of it's down to interpretation and even interpretation of any guidance that's available. So there's lots to look out for over the next year. And then, of course, the year after, if Theresa May gets her way, then there's a good chance that we'll be leaving Europe, and that in itself will bring some challenges with regards to how we are seen as an outside of EU country for the purposes of data protection. So over the next couple of years, there's actually going to be quite a lot of activity around data protection and the GDPR and what that means in the UK, not just because of it becoming into law next year, and there's the Brexit thing to consider as well. There's also a couple of other things to keep your eyes on. If you pay attention to politics and things, then you would have noticed in the Queen's speech a couple of weeks ago, the Queen announced the plans for a data protection bill, which there was quite a bit of confusion as to what that might actually mean, but the bill was something that the Tories put in their manifesto, and there's talk of it will cover things like how data is managed in online environments, particularly for young people. And I suspect what we'll probably see is that the bill will be the sort of enforcement in UK law of the GDPR, particularly post-Brexit, and also the vehicle that it will use for any derogations from the regulation that member states are allowed to add to their local law. There's also the e-privacy regulations, which are currently being scrutinised in Europe, and the e-privacy regulations will replace the e-privacy directive, which gave the UK the privacy and electronic communication regulations, which govern how electronic marketing is used and what's allowed, and it sort of sits alongside the Data Protection Act, and it's another piece of regulation that the ICO is the regulator for. Now, the reason why that's interesting is if you're working in a B2B environment, the rules around marketing to business using business to business data is very different to personal data, and they are governed mainly by PECO, the Privacy Electronic Communication Regulation. So if we're getting any new e-privacy regulation, then there's a good chance that there may be some changes in that area, or at least something to just keep an eye on if you are doing marketing in the B2B arena, or indeed marketing in general. It's another area of legislation that you need to pay attention to. And the other interesting thing with the privacy regulation is the EU wants to implement it at the same time that GDPR comes into effect, which is likely to be a challenge for them, given that it's less than a year away and they've still got to go through the three main areas of European governance to get that signed off. So who knows what that might mean, but collectively, with the GDPR coming, possibly a new e-privacy regulation and a data protection bill, there's quite a lot to keep an eye on in the data protection arena in the UK. But this talk's going to be about the GDPR. And probably one of the key things to think about is, well, what is data protection actually all about? Well, right at the centre of data protection is the processing of personal data. So that's data relating to living individuals. It's not data relating to corporate entities, although certain types of business data, it can be construed as personal data. For example, a employee's email address, which is their personal email address within that business, is personal data because it identifies them personally within that business, and there are a different set of rules around how that data can be processed. But typically, most businesses who need to really worry about data protection are those that deal with consumers. So it's personal data relating to living individuals. And the Data Protection Act and the GDPR is no different. Has a number of principles or approaches to what you can and can't do with that data, ranging from how you process it, fairness of processing, the purposes for which you process it, whether it's kept up to date and it's adequate, whether you're keeping it longer than whether you need to, whether it's secure, what you do if the data needs to be transferred outside of the European Union, and also the rights of the individual, so the data subject, which covers all different kinds of rights. Probably the most well-known one is the subject access right, which means that a data subject, so the individual whose personal data it is, had the right to ask a business to tell them what data they hold on them and what they do with it. That is pretty much what data protection is all about, and the GDPR is really no different. And in fact, if you're compliant with the Data Protection Act, generally speaking, whilst there's a few changes which will need to be taken into consideration, particularly around consent for processing, generally speaking, you're not going to be too far off compliance with the GDPR. But what I'm going to talk about are the 10 things that are changing, and they're highlighted in this fan, and we're going to go through each one of those. These are the key areas, as I see them, of where data protection law is going to change in some particular way in the UK. Not some of them are much bigger than others. So I'll swiftly move on to the first one, which is about scope. I mentioned it's a regulation, and that's different from an EU directive. A regulation applies to the whole of the European Union and members of the EU, and we've not left Europe yet, so it still applies to us. And if you do the maths, you'll work out that the law, GDPR, becomes law next year. Brexit is probably the year after, so there's at least a year's overlap. But the other important thing is it also relates to the processing of, under certain circumstances, EU citizens' data by businesses not domiciled within the EU. So it has a slightly extraterritorial approach to it. And then I've only got two there. There's actually three. Scope is it covers the whole of Europe as a regulation. The second one is it covers EU citizens' data, and the third one is the bottom one there, which is that it now includes data processors. So there's responsibility for data processors within the regulation. So just to clarify, three key definitions. You have a data subject, which is the person whose data it is that you may be collecting or processing. You have a data controller, which is the organization that's collected that data and is using it for processing or whatever purpose they've defined for the use of the data. And then you have the data processor, who may be the data controller, but in some circumstances may be another body or another party who is actually doing the processing. A good example of that is you may collect data on behalf, you might collect data for the purposes of marketing. So you would be collecting, say, names and email addresses for data subjects that you want to use for marketing. You would be the data controller because you've collected that data, but you might ship out that data to a third party for the purposes of doing an inbound or automated marketing service. So the interesting thing there is certainly in terms of who falls under the scope of data processors, and certainly cloud-based services is a key area that people are now having to wake up to the idea that if they provide a service that enables people to store or process personal data, then they have responsibilities which they are now governed by a regulation that could lead them down the path of investigation, fines and things like that they need to worry about much more than they've ever had to, where previously the responsibility was all on the data controller. Next change is definition. This is a pretty minor one. We've got a pretty good concept of what incorporates personal data in the UK in terms of best practice and various bits of guidance the Information Commission has published over the years. The GDPR adds a clarity that it now includes online identifiers. So if you're collecting data that can be used as an identifier online along with other data, then it will now be clearly personal data. So that's things like online ID tags in certain services and things like IP addresses and things like that. So a slightly wider definition of personal data than we've had before, but to be honest, it's more about clarifying what is and what isn't personal data, and most businesses have sort of operated on the premise that online data is as much personal data as a name and a physical address. This one, the next slide is about consent. They sort of slightly go hand in hand, but there's specific carve out in the regulations relating to children's data. The key thing being that if you're collecting or processing data relating to children, which may mean you need to carry out some age verification to verify whether somebody is or isn't a child, and it's not clear what that verification might actually look like and whether it needs to be any more than are you a child or not type of question. You need to do a number of things. One of them is get guardian consent for the processing of the data, and the other one is to provide information in a way that a child can understand it, which is probably not a bad thing for adults in general. But if you're processing children's data, you need guardian consent, and the information that you're presenting to the child has to be written in a way that they understand. And that's particularly pertinent if you're doing things around consent for the purposes of marketing. A child is defined as anyone under the age of 16, although there is a derogation. Remember, I mentioned derogations earlier, which enable member states to decide how young a child would be defined for the purposes of the regulation, as long as it doesn't go any below 13. So this could be one of the examples of where the Data Protection Bill defines the age of a child for the purposes of the regulation. But probably the most significant change is around consent. So that's consent for the purposes of processing, and this is a real key area for consideration, particularly if you're doing online marketing, because you need to now do a number of different things that you probably haven't done before. First of all, your messaging has to be very clear. You have to be very clear about what it is that you're collecting the data for, what you're going to do with it, and you can't hide away details about maybe you or your processing of that data in terms of conditions or in privacy statements. That has to be there at the point at which you're collecting the consent. You need to have a positive opt-in. So that means that the data subject has taken an affirmative action to actually consent to the processing of their data. So in a marketing world, that means that you will no longer be able to use the pre-tick boxes saying untick this box if you don't want to be marketed to, or we will imply that because you've told us not to market to, so you've not told us not to market to you, that it's okay for us to market to you. Those kind of things aren't going to happen anymore. It's going to have to be a very clear tick this box if you're happy to receive marketing information from us. Consent without detriment, that's basically saying that you can't withhold a service purely on the basis that somebody wishes to opt out of their consent, or isn't willing to offer the affirmative opt-in that you're asking them for. You have to be open and clear about who you're sharing the data with. So if you are engaging with a third party for the purposes of processing the data, or you're sharing that data with another party, then you need to be upfront and clear about that in your clear messaging that you at the point that you're collecting the data. You need to be clear about how they can withdraw their consent and change their mind, and obviously make a point of acknowledging that that is something that they're entitled to do, and pay attention when they do it, because you'll get into trouble if somebody's opted out and you're still carrying on processing their data in a way that they've asked you not to. And you also need to record the point at which the consent was made. So certainly, again, in the marketing, and I think this is probably the key area that the marketers will be worrying about, is you're going to have to be very clear and open about what you're going to do with the data, how you're going to use it for marketing purposes, get a positive opt-in. If you're sharing it with anybody for the purposes of collecting it or even processing it, then you need to be clear about that. And you need to be clear, make it clear how people can withdraw consent, record that consent, and that withdrawal, and record the fact that somebody consented at this particular time, and as far as you're aware, they haven't unconsented since. So quite a significant change, and this is one of the areas also to look out for the privacy regulation that I mentioned before. It's not in there right now, but there was a version of the privacy regulations leaked before Christmas, which implied that the same consent rules will apply to business as well. That's now been withdrawn, and it looks like the current draft, they will leave it to the member states to determine how business-to-business data is used for marketing purposes. So that's why I say that's one of the areas that is worthwhile keeping an eye on, particularly if you're working in a business-to-business environment. Oops, sorry, skipped through there. The same kind of rights that exist. We talked about individuals' rights, for example, subject access request. Something that's actually changing with subject access request is you'll no longer be able to charge £10 for the privilege of supplying the data that somebody's asked for under their right. So if you've used that in the past as a sort of a barrier to discourage people from doing it, then and it does act as a barrier for a lot of people, then that's no longer possible. So you might have to think about what's going to change in that area. But generally, the rights are exactly the same, except they've added two. So under the General Data Protection Regulation, there's now a right to erasure, so the right to be forgotten, as it's often called, which entitles a data subject to tell the controller that they no longer wish to have their data stored or processed for whatever purpose they might have had it in the past. That doesn't mean that they can say, I want you to delete all my banking details so that you can't bill me. That obviously you have rights to enable you to be able to deliver the service that somebody's contracted with you. But it does mean you'll need processes in place to make sure that when somebody does ask you to forget all of their data, that you're able to do that. And the other significant change is the addition of a right to data portability. Now, there is some Article 29 working party guidance on this. It essentially is a right that enables the data subject to request a copy of the data that you are holding on them in a format which enables them to use it in whatever way they feel they need to. The obvious format would be something like a CSV, comma separated variable file, where the data can be either imported into another system or accessed in Excel or something like that. And it doesn't have to be purely for the purposes of going from one service to a competitor's service. It might be that the data subject has a reason for having a collection of data and storing that locally to them. If you look at the Article 29 Working Party guidance, there's quite a bit of information in there and a kind of an expectation that actually you want to try and automate this process as much as possible. Clearly, that's going to vary depending on the size of your business. If you're a massive sort of corporate enterprise-sized business that's got thousands upon thousands, or probably tens of thousands of consumer clients, then probably automating is a no-brainer anyway. But it would be having a system in place, automated or otherwise, that enables you to respond to this request to have a copy of their data that is portable. And we're probably going to see some other outcomes in that area, like best practice in certain business areas, and that may be certified to show that you sign up to a best code of practice, or those kind of approaches, which will kind of standardize what the format the data is being made available in a portability sense. And it's probably worthwhile, if this is going to impact you significantly, to maybe look at what your industry body might be doing in this area to see whether you can help influence or guide what might work for you, to ensure that you're not being pushed down a particular route that doesn't work very well for you in terms of your own business. So two new individuals' rights to complement the existing ones, including things like subject access request, right to be forgotten, and the right to have your data exported in a common format. Under certain circumstances, you also have new recording requirements. Certain size businesses, for example, will need to record the processing activities that they carry out and how that's done, and that may be more relevant to certain people, data processors particularly, than most businesses, but it's certainly a new requirement, and this is all part of one of the aspects of the General Data Protection Regulation, which is accountability. So it's not just saying, yes, we're compliant, it's about actually being able to prove that you're compliant. And I know from talking to small businesses that a lot of the time the idea of compliance is being registered with the Information Commissioner and just knowing about the Data Protection Act. This is really sort of stepping up the game and saying, well, you need to be accountable and able to demonstrate that what you say you're doing, you're actually doing. So, so going back to consent, for example, that's why there's a requirement there to record the point at which you got that consent. And as I say, under some circumstances, there's also a requirement to record your data processing activities, so that if questioned, you can demonstrate that this is what you do with your data and how you process it. Data protection by design and by default actually is the terminology that's being used. This is not something new to UK, because the Information Commissioner has what it's called best practice around privacy impact assessments, which is the concept that if you're doing something with data, you've considered the ramifications on data protection and privacy. The GDPR has this concept of essentially two things. If you're going to build something new and have a service or deliver a particular function, then you need to consider data protection ramifications of that. And one of the tools for doing that is a data protection impact assessment. So that's about, this whole concept is about actually considering where data is going to be within your system and what that might mean to the privacy of the data subjects and the rights of the data subjects, and it's probably going to be a key role for anyone who's taken on responsibility for data protection, be they in a required position of authority as a data protection officer, or as a not required but appointed person within a business who has been told that they need to ensure data protection compliance is part of the business. And certainly if you're coming up with new products and new services, then you need to look at what does data protection by design and default and data protection impact assessments mean to you in that sort of project basis. Which brings us on to data protection officers, or DPOs. Some people call them data protection managers. Within the GDPR, it's about data protection officers. They are a bunch of people who take responsibility within an organisation for data protection compliance. Under some circumstances, the law requires you to have a data protection officer appointed. This is typically for somebody, for an organisation who processes a lot of data, or specific types of data, particularly sort of sensitive data, for example. There is a role, as I mentioned just a minute ago, for somebody who is responsible for data protection, who may become known as a data protection officer within the business, but they won't necessarily be a requirement under the regulation. So it's worth looking at that. If you work in an organisation that processes a lot of data on a regular basis, or that data processing is a key core activity, then you probably might need a data protection officer. And there's some Article 29 working party guidance on specifically who might need a DPO. There are no specific rules or guidance around what that DPO needs to be in terms of whether they have to be qualified in a particular way or anything like that. But they don't even have to be a full-time DPO. They don't have to be an employee. They can be somebody that's outsourced. It's just that there are very specific rules around the role of that person, and also the position of that person within the business. There's talk of it having to mean you need to have, the data protection officer has to have access at board level, and must be allowed to get on and do their job without being encumbered by internal politics around the fact that data protection and compliance and regulatory controls are always seen as a cost rather than a benefit to businesses because of the cost of actually meeting compliance. So the General Data Protection Regulation is trying to address that by saying, well, these people, if you need to have one, these people need to have a report into the board. They need to be taken seriously, and they can't be ignored within the organisation. So it's to sort of give that person some teeth to actually get on and do what they need to do. I mean, ideally, if you're employing somebody specifically to do data protection compliance, you would hope that you'd let them get on and do their job, but the law is there to back them up to stop people saying, well, I need to have one because it's a regulatory requirement, but I'll make their life so difficult that we never actually need to worry about it. The law doesn't allow that kind of activity to happen. Most businesses probably won't need data protection officers. It's going to be the large organisations that, as I say, process a lot of data, or processing of data is a core activity for the organisation. It's worth having a look at the Article 29 Working Party guidance. The breach mechanism, in some regulatory, in some industries, there's already a regulatory requirement. Telecoms, for example, there's a regulatory requirement actually covered in the Privacy Electronic Communication regulations around reporting breaches of data. But the GDPR unifies that across the whole of Europe and any type of business. And under certain circumstances, again, it will depend on the sort of size of your business and the risk of the data that's been leaked or breached as to whether you need to report to both the regulatory body, which in our case is currently the Information Commissioner's Office, or the data subject. This, as I said, this isn't something that exists in Data Protection Act right now, but in some areas of industries, certain industries that are controlled have regulatory requirements. That's one of the things that they have to already do. But for the rest of us, it does mean that we just need to be mindful that if we're processing data and there is a data breach, which is, security is still a principle of general data protection regulation. You want to do as much as you can and prove that you've done as much as you can to limit a breach. But if something does happen, then there is a possibility that you're going to have to tell the Information Commissioner about it and tell your subjects, which of course is all very harmful to brand and reputation. But this is a new requirement under the General Data Protection Regulation. And then finally, the sort of headline thing that always seems to precede any discussion about general data protection regulation is the fines. Under Data Protection Act, the Information Commissioner can fine up to £500,000 or £500,000. It's probably only ever, I think TalkTalk got the largest fine of about 400k. So it's all very proportionate, but under the GDPR, fines, there's actually two tiers of fines depending on what type of breach relates to, but sorry, what the breach of the regulation, that is. The highest level is 4% of global turnover or 20 million euros, so significantly larger than potentially £500,000 fine. And it doesn't matter what size business you are, 4% of global turnover, even if you're a small business operating in a specific area of the UK, that's still 4% of your turnover that's at risk of being fined. So it's a wake-up call for a lot of businesses. And then when you consider it in terms of all the other things that GDPR stands for around accountability and that kind of thing, you can see why lots of people lead with the fines as being the reason why you need to pay attention. Nobody is immune to the regulation. If you process personal data, it doesn't matter whether you've got two records in an Excel spreadsheet or whether you've got a complex Salesforce customer relationship management system in a multi-billion-pound corporate. The data protection rules apply if the data relates to personal data. So you just need to pay attention to the rules and what they might mean. So that's the end of my 10 slides. Time's ticking along, so I'll speed up a little. Of course, the next thing to think about is, well, where does that impact your business? And if it does impact your business, what can you do about it? Well, the obvious answer to that is you need to think about maybe carrying out an audit and consider your approach. And I see this very much as a 5-stage process. The last stage, manage, which I'll come to in a minute, is very cyclical. But essentially, you need to get yourself up to scratch, get your business up to scratch. If you have, depending on the size of your business, you might have a board or you might have senior management structure. You need to make sure that they're giving you, or they've got the buy-in, sorry, you've got the buy-in from them to ensure that you're able to go ahead and make sure that everything can go ahead, because they need to wake up to the fact that data protection rules are changing. And then you need to set up a working group of people across your business who will be impacted by the changes, and you need to take along the journey with you to ensure that the different areas of your business are compliant. So in a corporate sense, you might be looking at yourself leading a group of people that involve somebody from sales, somebody from customer services, somebody from technical support, somebody from IT who manages the systems, and so on, and maybe bring in somebody from internal and external communications so that you can work up a strategy around how do you communicate this internally and externally that you're compliant. But you need to basically get the business to accept that there is a change coming and they need to do something about it. You need to bring everybody up to speed, so that might be bringing them, bringing your working group together by initially holding a session about what does the General Data Protection Regulation actually mean for them and your business. And then the next step is actually looking at what data do you hold, what systems does that store that data, and what's your approach in terms of procedural and policies that you might have in place that addresses data protection. And remember, this is data relating to personal data, living individuals, of which your employees are also considered within that scope. So, this is much about HR policy and HR systems as it is about customer relationship management systems or your services and how you use the data within the service. So, under the audit area, or the section of your general audit, you want to look at producing a register really of your data, your systems and your policies, because the next step is analysing that and working out what do we need to do to fix the data or the systems or the policies, probably all three, to bring them up to speed with what the General Data Protection Regulation means for all of them. And just going back very briefly to consent, one of the things I didn't say was that of course, if you've got lots of data, particularly for marketing purposes from a legacy point of view, so you've been merrily collecting names and email addresses for marketing your products and services and your business too, you need to consider whether that data itself is compliant with the General Data Protection Regulation and do something about it if it's not. So within this sort of regime of carrying out an audit, you're sort of starting with, well, let's have somebody from the marketing team on our working group. What marketing data do you use? What systems do processes those data? And that can be anything from your Excel spreadsheet to your MailChimp to, as I say, a complex CRM system like Salesforce. And what policies do you have in place to make sure that people in the marketing team understand the rights and responsibilities under data protection? And then in the analyze stage, you're then assessing that data, those systems and those policies against what you know about the data protection regulation and what it will mean. And then the fourth stage is to look at actually delivering an action plan around getting yourself compliant. And remember, this compliance needs to be done by May next year. And one of the key areas is bringing everybody in your business up to speed with employee training about data protection. There's a sort of a bit of a geeky data protection joke of who's responsible for data protection in your organisation, and the joke is that actually everybody has a responsibility, but you need to make sure that businesses, different areas of your business, understand their specific responsibilities, particularly if they are handling personal data. So your sales team understand how they can use personal data in a different way than, say, the marketing guys, and things like customer services and tech support. They need to make sure that they are way that they handle data is managed properly, so they're not giving away personal data because somebody's rung up to pretend to be somebody else. So employee training is key in terms of a general overview for the whole of the business, but specific areas will need specific training. And then that brings us on to the management phase, which is a repetitive phase. That's not the end of it. This isn't an exercise that you can then put an underline and say, phew, I've done it, I don't need to worry about it until the next piece of legislation gets changed. You need to manage ongoing compliance. It's about keeping people up to date, making sure your policies are still relevant. And if you remember all the things I was saying earlier when we were looking at the timeline, you need to think about the fact that actually certain bits of guidance are going to be coming out, and what does that mean with regards to what you've been doing for your business. The rules may change. It may be interpreted in a different way when it becomes law next year. What happens because of Brexit? Where do we sit with the fact that we're processing European data and we're outside of Europe now, and all those kind of things? You need to keep yourself up to date, and you need to make sure that your staff are kept up to date. So keeping regular training. That's not training every month, but you might make a decision to make sure that your staff have a bit of training every year. And that your HR team deliver training to new employees on induction, those kind of things. But you need to have a process in place for managing compliance, let alone all of the other things around how do you manage user rights, the ongoing security, reviewing your policies and things like that. And if you get all of these things right and in place, and And there's probably one of the most important things is having a policy and a position in place, because if you document your approach, how you approach data protection and how it's managed within your organization, you've then got something that you can talk to the regulator, the information commissioner, if needs be, that is giving them an indication you've actually paid attention and done something about it, where you are likely to get caught out if you don't have anything to show them. And even if you get it wrong, if your policy or your approach is wrong or slightly wrong, they're more likely to tell you you've got it wrong and don't to do it again than they are to take it further. But if you've got nothing to show to them that you've actually even considered it, then you run the risk of investigation and fine or whatever. So managing compliance is important, and that's why, as I was saying about data protection officers, you might not have to officially have a data protection officer, but somebody within your business, if you're processing personal data, really ought to have a responsibility, and they need to be looking at all of these kind of things. So where does that take you? Well, you need to think about some of the things. I've touched on all of these already, you know, in terms of what guidance is coming, what case law might set out some of the changes or interpretations of the regulation, the privacy regulations coming, what the data protection bill might mean in the UK, along with Brexit and all those kind of things. So these are all areas that you need to keep an eye on, which really takes me on to the Digital Compliance Hub, which is that top left logo there, which is, as I said at the beginning, is a service I have set up under the Flavorfy Digital brand, and it's an online service aimed at providing advice and guidance, but also toolkits and general support and consultancy around a number of areas, including general data protection regulation, but also things like privacy and marketing rules and web and data cybersecurity. And then I run things like these webinars and other training and workshops for in-house teams or just general bringing people up to speed. And if I can get it to work quickly, I will very briefly, just quickly show you what I'm talking about. So this is the Digital Compliance Hub, and you've got different sections here, and you can click through to a particular area of interest. And for example, if you're in marketing and marketing consent is something you want to think about, then there's lots of guidance here about what actually is changing, which piece of laws you can use, and some tools. There's a number of tool sets within the Digital Compliance Hub that enable you to sort of guide you through what you need to think about. And I even have a toolkit specifically for carrying out an audit, so it can lead you through your audit plan following those 5 key areas that I spoke about earlier. So that's something to consider, and for coming along to this presentation. Oh, I just clicked off by accident. If you use hub-free-month, you can get a free month use of the hub and have a look and let us know what you think. If there's stuff there that you'd like to see that's not there yet, then we can certainly add that in. And the other side of it is the Flavorfy Digital Consultancy stuff. If you're looking for help specifically around data protection and GDPR, what it might mean for your organisation, and maybe you just need a couple of hours of time as somebody to run things through, then we offer those kind of services as well. So that was a very quick sales pitch. So moving on. If there are any, there's some times for questions. Let me just have a look. No questions at the moment. If you have anything you'd like to ask, then please, in the questions section in the control panel, type your question, and then I'll try and answer it during this session. If there aren't any questions, then we'll leave it at that and let you get on with your day. So nothing coming through. I hope that has been useful and it's giving you some thoughts and things to think about with regards to how the GDPR impacts your business, and obviously get in touch if there's any specific help. If you're not sure, if something comes to mind that you wish you'd asked during this webinar, then you know, by all means ping me an email, and you should see my email address on the screen right now. Other than that, thank you very much for attending. I will be in touch with a copy of the recording of the session in due course, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.